Hi, welcome to this video that I have kind of planned, but I also kind of haven't, and I just thought I would actually just go for it. So we'll see what happens. I think about 2, maybe 3 years ago at this point, I made a video on this channel, which was sort of supposed to be like a series, and then I haven't done anything for it. That video was called Carenotes, and it was about books about sickness, and I talked a bit about, books I had read recently that discuss sickness and care, and the way that their representations like entwined and split apart, and kind of how they represented sick life and how that felt relatable. I have wanted to make another in that series for a while, but I've never kind of figured out how to do it, and then obviously like COVID happened, which felt like both the right time to do it and also just felt like too much of a time to do it. But then I was thinking recently that I think it's been about a year since I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, and you know, that video that I made before, like I hadn't been diagnosed yet, and so I thought it might be kind of fun to like talk about diagnosis in the context of like some books, and also think about what has changed, what hasn't changed, the banality of a diagnosis, and also the like continued lack of care that a diagnosis has given me, and then also obviously some of the like good things about a diagnosis and legibility and things like that. I'm pretty sure it's literally like a year ago this month, because I think I got diagnosed in February 2020. Please hold. Yeah, pretty much 1 year ago, maybe slightly like a year and 2 weeks at this point. But yeah, I thought we would go for kind of like vague senses of sickness and then kind of follow that route to a more legible, stratified conclusion. And I hope it's also a way to think about like the implications of diagnoses, and also the implications, like the power implications inherent in a care system and or state that has control over health, and what that does to people, and how it can be useful and dangerous depending on who you are, and also just like useful and dangerous generally. The first book I want to talk about I have spoken about before, and that's Saltfish Girl by Larissa. This novel, like, it doesn't have any specific sickness. You could perhaps argue it's more about non-normative bodies more so than sickness, but I think they're both kind of interrelated, and I think they're done in a very specific way. Like, I think there is part of the sickness that is about being queer, and there's part of the queerness that is about being sick. Saltfish Girl follows like two kind of timelines happening at different times, but you're reading them at the same time, like one chapter after another. One of them is a future timeline for us, and it's set in, I think, what is Canada now, in 2044, and then the other one is, I think it starts in South China in the late 1800s, and then it goes on from there. Yeah, and so it's following these two characters, and it's telling kind of love stories and growing up stories. One of them is a kind of slippery water goddess figure. I also haven't read this in a while, so maybe I'm a bit hazy, which sort of fits my point too, I guess. One of the characters, Miranda, she is born with like a really pungent smell that emanates all the time from her, and some people think it's gross and some people like it. She smells like the durian fruit. That the same imagery of the fruit and the same kind of like enticing gross smell kind of permeates through the whole novel. She also has, I think it's like in her earlobe, she has like holes in them, and they like emanate fluid. And as a kid, she's like put through a lot of like treatments and tried to be cured of this smell, like by her family. I think mostly by her dad. Her mum's a bit like, it is what it is. Like, yeah, it's just a really interesting book. I think it says a lot without saying specifics in a way that is really interesting. It also talks a lot about reproduction and clones, which is quite a Larissa preoccupation. In her other book, The Tiger Flu, they're also clones. And yeah, and it is also a love story in a really nice way. I really enjoyed that part too. I think something that kind of maybe, I mean, in a very different way, I think bridges the gap almost between this kind of nebulous sense of sickness and non-normativity that fluctuates through Saltfish Girl, and something more about like the very stratified, definite corners of diagnostical sickness, is a poem by a poet called lee-houghton, I think, that I actually recorded myself reading all of. The poem is called Letter to Dr. Moosa Regarding My Inconstant Heart. I think it's in the collection Sunshine, and it's about psychiatry and also mental illness and self-harm and all sorts of things. I don't think any of them have gone into specific detail, but in case you don't want to hear about those things, then I would skip ahead. I can tell you when I stop talking about this poem on the screen. So having reread the poem, I think something that it is interesting, and it is something that comes up against both the need for a cure, and within that cure the need for like complete kind of illumination about what is wrong, and how that's really uncomfortable and painful in a relationship between a patient and a doctor, especially because the power dynamic is really skewed. I'm not sure if I like wholly agree or like how all of it is written and all of it is represented, I guess, but like I think it both demonstrates how when one of us is sick in the ways that we are, that implicates everything. It's not the same thing as just being able to like section it off and be like, well, this person has this thing, this person has this thing. It's like in the society where people have these things, the wider society, everybody else also contains these things and also is implicated and complicit in their development and continuance and their painfulness. She writes, my diagnosis catches all the running breast milk. And also, yeah, there is this like interplay going on. Like she says, sometimes I imitate and then disturb your thinking. She writes, when I'm angry, you turn away in your swivel chair. Consult the DSM handbook, its cover stained with the 10 years of betraying perspiration. But my dear, you search for answers that are not there. The DSM handbook is like where diagnosis criteria is written up. It's edited by a group of like psychiatrists. It's extremely constructed. I mean, obviously these things have an effect on people's lives, but they are stratified by humans and in ways that often suggest particular approaches to different types of people who experience different things, who have different identities, who come from different places. It's like not all diagnoses are equal, basically, like or are like equally given out to people. Does that make sense? God, I hope that makes sense. Things being a bit illegible and difficult to talk about kind of fits with the vibe I'm going for. So the next book I wanted to talk about is another book that I don't have with me, which is a shame because I would have liked to probably read you some poems from it. But that's Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith, which is a poetry book about a lot of things, specifically like black boyhood and masculinity and grief. But it is also a book about being HIV positive, and I think it's also a book about being HIV positive, that not being a death sentence and that being part of your life-giving sustenance, part of your blood, like part of your ability to connect with people. And it's a wonderful collection of poems. I would really, really recommend it. But again, I do also think it kind of considers this like lack of borders, lack of permeability between like the sick and the unsick, because in a world where people are sick, who isn't sick? And then obviously there are very specific dimensions, and HIV positive people often are really stigmatized, not only because of the diagnosis or the virus itself, but also because of the implications it has around having like unclean sex and queerness, specifically HIV positivity and like AIDS and things like that. That is all still very much present in people's day-to-day life in a way that I think people often forget about / want to be like, well, that was just the 1980s, like it was just a problem then, we're done with it, which isn't the case. The other book that I thought I would talk about that is also about AIDS and HIV is this book, Close to the Knives, a memoir of disintegration by wojnarowicz. This is a very difficult book to read. I think I have spoken about it on my channel before, so I won't talk about it with that much detail, but it covers a lot of things, and it is very much about that rage, that grief, that anger around living in a community of people who are slowly dying from AIDS, the government neglect, and the way that because of the correlation between AIDS and queerness and deep homophobia, that like compounded the complete lack of care, and the number of deaths due to AIDS happened. I guess with this book specifically, I wanted to make the point that having a diagnosis, having a specific thing that's wrong with you, allows you to be vulnerable to people who then see those specific things as meaning that you do not deserve care, you know, in a way that is very difficult to contend with, but is absolutely part of the violence of healthcare under capitalist society. It is also about the deep sadness of and tenderness of that sadness of losing all of your friends to something that like maybe would still be devastating but could have been much less devastating. I hope this sort of covers some ways the diagnosis is represented and how it feels. I definitely felt very underwhelmed when I was diagnosed finally, and nothing really has changed. I mean, I do get access to specific medication, but it doesn't help. And I do still have to take it, and I don't really feel like that in control of my situation, which isn't something that has changed. I'm still in immense pain a lot. Like, you know, I'm not saying to people who want a diagnosis, because that was me for a very long time, that it's not worth trying to do. Like, I do understand that, but unfortunately it just doesn't heal you from all of the medical neglect that you previously have experienced at the hands of the healthcare system, and it doesn't also like help you in trying to navigate it later either. I mean, it does in some ways, and definitely in kind of more bureaucratic ways it does, but I think emotionally, like, this hasn't really done much. I thought I would end with another poem. This one is by Elizabeth Bishop, and it's called Insomnia, and I think I wanted to choose this because I'm not entirely sure, but in a way I kind of like that unsurety, because that's sort of part of the point I'm making. And I also felt like it kind of represented like the blurry intimacy of like entering the sick world, and for me insomnia is massively tied up in how I experience my sickness, my disability, all of that stuff, so that's also maybe it's like personal to me why I would choose this. I definitely feel like being an insomniac makes you feel like a ghost, so you're like haunting yourself almost, and I think Elizabeth Bishop kind of gets it with this poem. I feel like maybe the poem also speaks a little bit to the idea of like being sick and caring for each other, two sick people caring together and loving, which I think is really the only way to make any of this bearable. Insomnia, here we go. The moon in the burrow mirror looks out 1,000,000 miles, and perhaps with pride at herself, but she never smiles. Far and away, beyond sleep, or perhaps she's a daytime sleeper. By the universe deserted, she'd tell it to go to hell, and she'd find a body of water, or a mirror on which to dwell. So wrap up care in a cobweb and drop it down the well, into that world inverted, where left is always right, where the shadows are really the body, where we stay awake all night, where the heavens are shallow as the sea, is now deep, and you love me.